Good day. Over the course of my video yesterday, I discussed certain reports that had been discussed in Russian media, including a television interview with an important official from one of the two Donbass republics, which suggested that the Ukrainians were on the verge of withdrawing their forces from Soledar, and that this withdrawal would take place over the course of last night. Well, very late in the evening yesterday, after I made my video and after it was published, more reports to that effect appeared. There were reports that President Zelensky of Ukraine had had a meeting with top military officials, including General Zaluzhny, that General Zaluzhny had reported to President Zelensky that the situation in Soledar was becoming critical, that Ukrainian troops would have to withdraw from Soledar as soon as possible. Otherwise, they risked becoming trapped inside Soledar. And President Zelensky himself made public statements to the effect that the situation in Soledar was becoming very difficult. And these reports also from Ukraine also seemed to lend credibility to rumors which early last night were proliferating, that the Ukrainians were about to withdraw from Soledar. Well, last night has come and gone. Today is today. We're now well towards the evening of the following day after those rumors circulated, and there are still Ukrainian troops in Soledar. However, it seems that though there has been no Ukrainian withdrawal from Soledar, at least up to this point, it does seem that the position of the Ukrainian troops in Soledar is becoming increasingly desperate. And today, there's been a certain amount of coverage of the Battle of Soledar in the Western media. There have been reports on Reuters. There was even briefly a report in the Daily Telegraph that appeared to claim that Soledar had actually fallen. In other words, that the Russians had taken complete control over it. But anyway, there is a general acceptance or acknowledgement that one way or the other, the Battle of Soledar is coming to an end, and this town is going to soon fall under Russian control. And one can already see all sorts of explanations for this, that it's a place of little strategic significance, that it's one of those rare victories that the Russians have been achieving in Ukraine, despite the fact that overall they're losing the war. You can see all this narrative pouring out, but nonetheless, there is generally an acknowledgement that the situation in Soledar is becoming increasingly critical. Now, there have been a number of accounts and discussions about what's been happening in Soledar and how we reached this point. I'm going to now read an account of the battle, of how the battle evolved, that comes from a Russian or pro-Russian channel, which I ought to say has been designated by the United States government as being controlled and funded by the Russian intelligence agencies. I don't have any way of either proving or disproving that fact. All I would say that this particular channel, this particular site, does provide a great deal of interesting and reliable information. It may have those Russian government connections that the US government claims. They, by the way, emphatically deny it. But one way or the other, the information they do provide can often be interesting and revealing. And by the way, they're often very critical of the Russian authorities as well. And on this occasion, I think that their account of what happened in the fighting in Soledar is probably as reliable as any you're going to see. And this is their account, and I'm going to read it. It says, on January 9th, the headquarters of the Defense Ministry of the Donetsk People's Republic officially confirmed that the Russian armed forces took control of the village of Bakhmutskoye, located on the outskirts of Soledar. The first reports about the Russian control of the village came about a week ago. Today, the information was confirmed by local military officials. In turn, Wagner fighters, in other words, fighters from the Wagner organization, have earlier claimed that they do not claim control of a settlement immediately after the enemy leaves it, but wait for several days in order to assure security in the area. The village of Bakhmutskoye is located on the southeastern outskirts of the town of Soledar. In fact, the two, from the maps, seem to be so close to each other that you could almost say that they are adjoining. And I would personally consider Bakhmutskoye may have an independent legal identity, but as far as I can see, it's essentially a suburb or extension of Soledar itself. Anyway, to continue, the village of Bakhmutskoye is located on the southeastern outskirts of the town of Soledar. At the end of the mop-up operation in the village, Russian fighters advanced along the road and entered Soledar. By now, street fighting has already broken out in the central district of the city of Soledar. On January 9th, the head of the Wagner organization, Yevgeny Prigozhin, claimed that the battle for the city administration building is currently ongoing in the very center of Soledar. The building of Soledar City Council is also located next to the administration building. Footage of street fighting in Soledar, filmed by Ukrainian soldiers, confirms these claims. And then there is links to various videos, and there's also a satellite map. And then it goes on to say this: the Ukrainian garrison in Soledar is tactically surrounded. After Wagner organization fighters took control of the village of Yakovlevka, located to the north of Soledar, they advanced in the fields and blockaded the town from the north. The defense is held by scattered detachments of Ukrainian formations, which are suffering heavy losses and lack military supplies. As a result of lack of communication, their retreat is badly coordinated and leads to more deaths in Ukrainian ranks. Well, that's what this website is claiming. Ukrainian units have mainly retreated to the western part of Soledar and are attempting to defend their positions in multi-story buildings and in the salt mines. To the north, the Ukrainian forces are still holding their positions in the area of the Artyomsol plant. And it's been explained to me on one of the threads I think it was my last video, that the Artyomsol plant is in fact the name for the overall company that runs the various salt mines in this area in Soledar and in Bakhmut itself. And then the article goes on to refute claims that the Ukrainians have actually completely retreated from Soledar, but it says that though the Ukrainian military may decide to continue the battle in Soledar in order to inflict losses on the Russians, the fact is that the Ukrainians defending themselves in Soledar are now in a critical position, and I think pretty much everyone accepts this. Now, I want to stress this is not information that I have obtained directly from the battle lines. It's information that's come to me from checking open sources. Others may have other information than I do. But I think it all sounds plausible to me. It seems to me to be the most accurate account of what's happening on the battlefields. And it's just occurred to me that I've not mentioned the name of the site that has provided this information. It is in fact called South Front. But as I said, remember what I've said, it is pro-Russian aligned, and the US claims that it is Russian government funded and controlled, though I have no way of knowing that that is so, and they themselves deny that it is so. Anyway, that's the situation according to their account of the fighting. Now, there have also been other reports over the course of today that the Ukrainians are not just about to evacuate from Soledar, but that they're about to evacuate from Bakhmut as well. Bakhmut being, of course, a much bigger place located to the south of Soledar, that with the collapse of Ukrainian defenses in Soledar and with the fall of Soledar being now only a question of a few days or perhaps hours, that the Ukrainians are going to evacuate from Bakhmut also. And again, yesterday and early this morning, there was a trickle of reports appearing from various Russian channels that indeed the Ukrainians were about to pull out of Bakhmut, and that Bakhmut also was about to fall. Well, I think that is definitely premature. I've seen no evidence of any Ukrainian pullout from Bakhmut up to this point. And yesterday, a official, a Russian military officer by the name of Vladimir Novikov, who apparently is the commander of the Troy Russian Volunteer Special Forces Unit, provided what perhaps is a rather more plausible time scale for the possible capture of Bakhmut. He said it could happen within a couple of weeks. And he said, if the Wagner private military company keeps its current pace of the offensive in the next couple of weeks, the Ukrainian command will have to look at withdrawing troops from, well, he calls it Artyomovsk, Bakhmut, in other words, to avoid its entrapment and consequently total destruction. And we're told by TASS, I'm taking this from the official Russian news agency TASS, we're told by TASS that this is what this person, Commander Novikov, has written on his Telegram channel. And Novikov then goes on to say, slowly but surely the contours and lines of division of the Ukrainian army's Soledar Bakhmut group are taking shape. The Ukrainian army's 17th Tank Brigade, which was deployed a couple of weeks ago, has failed to close the hole between Soledar and Artyomovsk. Concurrently, the Ukrainian Army Command has withdrawn the 128th Mountain Assault Brigade from this direction to prevent the final loss of efficiency of this unit, which is regarded as an elite infantry force. And other commanders, Russian commanders, including Apti Alaudin, who is, by the way, not Russian, he's Chechen, and who is the commander of the Bakhmut Special Forces units and is deputy commander of the 2nd Army Corps of the People's Militia of the Lugansk People's Republic, has also said that Soledar and Artyomovsk could be liberated in the coming days. And he says that soldiers of the Wagner organization have made progress in those parts of the front which are essential for the logistics of the Ukrainian troops who are defending themselves in Bakhmut and Soledar. So it does look increasingly as if there is Ukraine is facing a very severe operational crisis in Soledar and Bakhmut. But I want to stress again, fighting there is still continuing. Ukraine is still resisting, its forces are still resisting in Bakhmut and in Soledar. There's not yet been anything that could be described as a military collapse. Perhaps that will come. Perhaps the Ukrainians are indeed going to pull out, but for the moment they're still putting up such resistance as they can. I suspect nonetheless and overall that the battle in this part of the Ukrainian war is indeed coming to an end, and that we will learn before long that this fight, which has gone on for so many months, is now reaching finally its end point. What I would say is that I'm going to just return again to that point I've made before, that a lot of people talk about the duration of this battle as being a success for Ukraine. The fact that the Ukrainians have been able to hold on to Bakhmut and indeed Soledar since August, that they talk about this as being some sort of success for Ukraine. Given the extraordinary high cost that Ukraine has paid in terms of the lives of its soldiers for holding on to Bakhmut for all this time, I personally cannot see it as a success. I see rather as compounding the failure by increasing the cost when Bakhmut itself falls. And going back to that article by the journalist Dmitry Laskaris, which I discussed recently in another video, in which Dmitry Laskaris interviews Western volunteers who have fought alongside the Ukrainian army over the course of this war. One of them, a person called Mogelson, who I believe is Canadian, has this to say about what happened to a Ukrainian military formation that was defending Bakhmut. And again, I'm reading it from Dmitry Laskaris' article. The foreign soldiers were attached to a unit led by Ukrainian soldiers from the 72nd Mechanized Brigade. This brigade had previously served in Bakhmut, where, and now we have quotations from Mogelson, an enormous number of soldiers had died and even more had been wounded. The trauma of Bakhmut had unnerved many of the survivors, and now they seemed wary of outsiders. And that includes, by the way, the Western volunteers who were attached to this brigade. And then Mogelson continues, many of the professional soldiers in the 72nd Mechanized Brigade had been killed or injured in Bakhmut. Conscripts had replenished the ranks. Some had attended a 3-week basic infantry course in the United Kingdom with instructors from across Europe. 3 weeks, as has been explained by people like Brian Batletic and others, is completely inadequate to train infantry for modern war. But anyway, to continue with what Mogelson has to say, but most had received only minimal training before being given Kalashnikovs and being dispatched to the front. Turtle, one of the foreign soldiers from the unit in which Mogelson was embedded, told Mogelson about a recent mission to Pavlivka, and how apparently, partly as a result of all of these traumas and suspicions, a firefight broke out between a Ukrainian unit and some of these foreign soldiers. And anyway, I'm not going to read more about that because it's all rather distressing. There's a link to Dmitry Laskaris' article under this video, and you can read it there if you wish. But anyway, that is, again, corroboration from a Western source about the enormous losses that Ukraine is experiencing defending places like Bakhmut. We see that one particular unit, the 72nd Mechanized Brigade of the Ukrainian army, suffered losses. An enormous number of soldiers were killed and even more were wounded. This unnerved many of the survivors, who as a result became suspicious of outsiders. Many of the professional soldiers were killed and they've been replaced by conscripts, most of whom have either 3-week training obtained in Britain or apparently minimal training, which from the sound of it sounds like almost no training at all. So that's where we are. I don't see how one can qualify any of this as a success. Now, having said that, we are again hearing reports that the West, looking at these events, is now thinking of sending more military equipment. And Britain is now thinking apparently of sending all of 10 Challenger 2 tanks. 10 tanks is not going to make any difference in a war where numbers of tanks are counted in the hundreds. And I would add that 10 of these 75-ton behemoths, which is what the Challenger 2 tank is, are going to have all of the massive maintenance and supply issues that I've talked about in previous videos where Western equipment is concerned. And I suspect that maintaining them in the battle lines is going to make for more problems than these tanks can possibly solve. Nonetheless, at some point, I think with all the doubts, we are going to see Western tanks in Ukraine. And as I said, far from being an asset, I personally would not be surprised if instead they turn out to be something of a liability. If the logistics that the logistical challenges that the Ukrainians face operating these vehicles is greater, it takes up more time and resources to solve than whatever benefits these heavy tanks provide. But anyway, that's where we are at the moment on the battlefields. Now, I'm going to discuss 2 interviews that have just been. One is with a American general, Lieutenant General Bierman, who is a U.S. Marine Corps officer, and who's talking about the situation in the Far East. And the other is with the very powerful secretary of Russia's Security Council, Nikolai Patrushev. But anyway, let's turn first to Lieutenant General Bierman. Now, General Bierman has given an article to the Financial Times, an interview to the Financial Times, in which he's discussing the preparations that the United States is making for what looks like a war with China in the Pacific region. It's a very disturbing part of his interview, even as it stands, but I'm going to focus on what he has to say about Ukraine, because he has a lot to say about Ukraine, even though it doesn't seem to be directly related to the issues about the Pacific, which is what he's being purportedly interviewed about. And this is what he has to say about Ukraine, and I'm quoting him directly. Why have we achieved the level of success we've achieved in Ukraine? A big part of that has been because after Russian aggression in 2014 and 2015, we earnestly got after preparing for future conflict, training for the Ukrainians, pre-positioning of supplies, identification of sites from which we could operate support, sustain operations. Now, that appears to confirm that the United States military has been heavily preparing Ukraine for war since 2014, 2015. Even during the period, presumably, when Barack Obama was still president and when there was no authorization for the supply of US weapons to Ukraine, it seems that the US military was on the spot preparing Ukraine for war. Now, General Bierman seems to think that this has been a good thing, that it's provided a level of success which the United States has achieved in Ukraine. I look at the situation in Ukraine and I beg to differ. What has all this military support that the United States given to Ukraine actually achieved? Well, it's prolonged the war that we've seen break out in 2022, in February 2022. Perhaps I should say it has prolonged the resumption of the war, which broke out in February 2022. But the consequences for Ukraine have been devastating. And I've just discussed the enormous losses that Ukraine has suffered in the Bakhmut, Soledar area. And it seems that Ukraine is going to suffer more losses still. And it seems that despite all of these steps that General Bierman is talking about, training for the Ukrainians, the pre-positioning of supplies, the identification of sites from which we could operate support, sustain operations. Despite all of that, it looks like Ukraine is about to lose another significant chunk of Donbass, which is where the main theatre of this war is being fought. And I'm going to add something further still, because of course General Bierman doesn't mention the Minsk agreement. If all of these military supplies, or this training, or this identification of sites from which the United States could operate support and sustain operations, if all it's done is encourage the Ukrainians to violate the Minsk II agreement, which they did, and if it has provoked the Russians into launching their special military operation against Ukraine, which the Russians have repeatedly said it has done, though the Russians have said that it's only one of the factors that caused them to take the step that they did. Well, I would say that all those steps that General Bierman is talking about, the training of Ukrainians, the pre-positioning of supplies, the identification of sites from which to operate and support and sustain operations, all it's done is that it's provided Ukraine with a roadmap to disaster. And not just perhaps to Ukraine, but for the entire collective West as well, if the eventual outcome is a clear-cut Russian victory, which I believe is not only possible, but also by far the most likely outcome to this particular war. But anyway, here we have proof, if you want it, from a very senior American military source, that the United States has been busy preparing for war in Ukraine for a very long time, not just since February 2024, but from well before this, when the Russians, in the run-up to the war, were bitterly complaining that rather than support the peace initiatives in Ukraine, rather than encourage Ukraine to fulfill the obligations it had taken upon itself in the Minsk II agreement, that the Western powers were instead pumping Ukraine with weapons, something which they repeatedly complained about in the run-up to the war. Well, when the Russians were making those complaints, it turns out that their complaints were true. They were actually describing the real situation. To repeat again General Bierman's words, Why have we achieved the level of success we've achieved in Ukraine? A big part of that is because after Russian aggression in 2014 and 2015, we earnestly got after preparing for future conflict, training for the Ukrainians, pre-positioning of supplies. What supplies, by the way? Weapons? Most probably. Identification of sites from which we could operate, support, sustain operations. And by the way, before I leave General Bierman, he's talking about the fact that he talks in this interview with the Financial Times about the fact that the United States is doing exactly the same thing in the Pacific. To quote his words again, we call that setting the theatre for war, in other words, war in Ukraine, war in the Pacific as well. And we are setting the theatre in Japan, in the Philippines, in other locations. I have to say, I find these words extremely disturbing given the results that they have produced in Ukraine itself, and given General Bierman's apparent inability to learn the true lesson of those results, and the fact that he seems intent on repeating the same pattern of activities in the Pacific, contending against China. But anyway, that's General Bierman. I'm now going to turn to an actually even more senior official, a more important official in some ways, and that is Nikolai Patrushev, the Secretary of Russia's Security Council. You could call him President Putin's national security advisor. And Patrushev has given an interview to a Russian newspaper called Argumenty и Fakti. Important newspaper, dates back from the Soviet era. And for the record, this article was timed to coincide with the commemorations which have taken place in Russia of the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Soviet Union. A curious and interesting date and timing of this. Anyway, this is an extraordinarily long and extensive interview that Patrushev has given. And I'm not going to read it all out, especially as there's no complete English translation that I know of. There is you can obtain a machine translation. But he does make some really extraordinary points. He basically says that in the West, politics, as these things are conventionally understood, have effectively broken down. Power is no longer exercised by elected politicians. Power, according to Patrushev, is now exercised by a conglomerate of giant corporations that basically rule the West. And he says things like this. He says the American state is just a shell for a conglomerate of huge corporations that rule the country and try to dominate the world. For transnational companies, even US presidents are just extras who can be shut up like Trump. And he then talks about all 4 assassinations of American leaders. He doesn't specify which leaders, you can guess, but anyway, are connected to this corporate trail. It is no coincidence that a growing number of Americans are saying that Republicans and Democrats are just 2 actors in one play that has nothing to do with democracy. And a great deal of this interview is about this theory, this viewpoint, which I have to say would have been a viewpoint that would not have been entirely out of, you might have expected to see it in the Soviet Union as well. And perhaps it's not surprising that it's now being repeated to time with the commemoration of the 100th anniversary of the creation of the Soviet Union, though it is interesting that it is coming from such a senior Russian official. But Patrushev then goes on to talk about debt issues in the United States. He says the fact that the United States itself and its allies, he uses a stronger word, are irretrievably sliding into a debt hole is a major problem. The American public debt has reached more than $131 trillion. This is true, by the way. England's $2.4 trillion debt is the highest it has been since World War II, exceeding 101% of gross domestic product. I believe that is true as well. The world record for ratio of debt to GDP, more than 2.6 times, has been set by Japan with a public debt of almost $10 trillion. I believe that is also true. Only the countries that consider themselves masters of the world are not going to repay these debts. Previously, the West came to prosperity and achieved world domination through conquest. This is exactly how multinational companies behave today, preferring to increase their capital by pumping resources from other countries. At the same time, they use their system of indoctrinating the masses in order to impose on the population of the planet in every possible way the idea of certain rules that they themselves came up with and do not comply with international law. Well, it's a rather more vivid and punchy view of the state of the world than the one that Putin has expressed in recent speeches, but it's not that different. And he also says that Russia itself has no place in a system like this, and that is the reason for the West's hostility to it. There is no place for our country in the West. Russia annoys a bunch of the world's rulers because it has rich resources, a vast territory, intelligent and self-sufficient people who love their country, its traditions and history. Big corporations are unnerved by the worldview and ideological divergence between Russia and countries controlled by Western capital. Corporations are aimed at enriching and developing the consumer society, whereas in Russia, we uphold a reasonable balance of spiritual and moral values and socio-economic development. And then he discusses at length how the West has repeatedly tried to weaken Russia, to dismember it, to destroy the Russian language and the Russian world, and how they've developed a whole sophisticated mechanisms in order to achieve these things. Again, it's a rather heavy stuff, but you can see where it's coming from, and I repeat again that it is not that different from the sort of things that Putin has been saying. And then he says things which makes a number of comments, which are the ones which I've seen most widely publicized amongst his comments in the West. The events in Ukraine are not a clash between Moscow and Kiev. This is a military confrontation between NATO and, above all, the United States and England. Important to notice, by the way, he refers to England rather than Britain, with Russia. Fearing direct contact, NATO instructors are driving Ukrainians to certain death. With the help of a special military operation, Russia is liberating its regions from occupation and must put an end to the bloody experiment of the West, destroying the fraternal Ukrainian people. We are not at war with Ukraine because, by definition, we cannot have hatred for ordinary Ukrainians. Ukrainian traditions are close to us, just as the heritage of the Russian people is inseparable from the culture of Ukraine. Please note that in Crimea, Ukrainian language is preserved as one of the state languages. Ukrainian cultural centers, Ukrainian song and dance ensembles continue to operate in many of our Russian cities. In the south of the Far East, that's to say in Russia's Pacific, given the large proportion of migrants from Ukraine who went there from the time of Stolypin, that's Nicholas II's, one of Nicholas II's prime ministers, a significant number of residents consider their native culture to be Ukrainian. And he talks a great deal about this. He also says, as we've discussed previously on the Duran, that the pullout from Afghanistan might have been, or looked like it was, in preparation for the war in Ukraine. And he mentions the fact that this seems to have been confirmed by US Secretary of State Blinken, and he quotes him as saying, if the US military had not left Afghanistan, Washington would not have been able to allocate so much money to Ukraine. Anyway, quite a interesting interview, very interesting take from the man who is President Putin's national security advisor. Of course, you're going to find lots of people in the West, Western governments and Western media who say all this is paranoid. Well, I leave it to you to decide whether it is paranoid or not, but it does seem to inform Russian policy, and it explains to us why the Russians are pressing on with this conflict in Ukraine with the intensity that they are. Well, that's me for the day. A shorter video this time. As I said, we are waiting to see more information from what happens on the battlefields in Bakhmut, Soledar. I suspect that within a day or so, the information from this battlefront will have been clarified, and I'll be able to provide you all with a more clearer account of the state of the actual fighting. But I hope that this has all been useful. And in the meantime, just to remind you that we are present on multiple platforms, including Locals, Rumble, BitChute, Odyssey, Rockfin, and Telegram. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. You should also check out our shop, where you can find all the great things that we have there: our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, and all those things. And last but not least, if you like this video, please remember to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Well, that's me for the day. More from me soon. Have a very good day until then, and thank you for joining me once more.